Hello and welcome back to another episode of A Guide to B2B Podcasting. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about podcast websites and podcast web strategy. Do you need a website for your podcast? We're going to answer that question in this episode. So for most B2C shows, the answer of should you have a podcast website specifically for your podcast is the answer is yes. But when it comes to B2B podcasts, the answer is not always that easy. And so in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the various paths that B2B companies can take when it comes to their web strategy surrounding their podcast and give you the various different options. So when it comes to podcast web strategy, there are three options to choose from. First, you create a standalone podcast website. Second, you publish a podcast on your company's website. Or third is a secret option. It's actually the best of both worlds, and I'm going to save that one for later. So let's dive into option one here. When should a B2B company create a podcast website? And when I'm talking about a podcast website, I'm talking about a standalone website that has its own domain name, that has it's not on your podcast website, but is completely separate. So we recommend that companies create their own podcast website whenever they're wanting to really create a media property or a brand, something separate from their company. This tends to be really great when you're looking at an objective of your podcast being really an account-based marketing focus. So if you're wanting to reach out and get external guests and really use your podcast as networking, a external website is really helpful because it lets you almost create a media property that it could be sponsored by your company, but it doesn't have to actually be its own company. I'll give you a great example of this. We run the Hospitality Leaders podcast, and it is actually funded and run by a company called Upshift. But we didn't actually put this podcast all on Upshift's website because ultimately this is a kind of standalone property. It's this thing that hospitality people want to be a part of. Now, would they want to be a part of Upshift's blog? Maybe, maybe not, but probably a lower chances versus being a part of what looks kind of like a media property or a trade publication in the industry. So this is the really powerful thing of creating a podcast website, is it lets you create this kind of perception of you're almost creating your own trade publication in the niche. We have another customer who's done phenomenal with this, who has taken this to the next level. He runs the Disruptive Innovators podcast. And if you look at this, on top of his podcast, David and his team have built an entire event that they're pursuing as well. So you actually have this entire live in-person event. And so they really are, the podcast was the start of what is ultimately becoming a specialized trade publication or trade association for CIOs. And so this is where it's really cool, is separate brand is great when you want to create that media property in the industry. And because this is going to, again, people are probably not going to want to be a part of your blog as a small company. But if you have this, what looks like a trade publication, people are much more likely to say yes. We also see this approach tend to work really well with smaller companies because a lot of times smaller companies do not have strong domain authority. If you don't know what domain authority is, that basically means that's how credible Google thinks your website is. If you're looking at a large enterprise company, which we're going to dive into in a second, large enterprises often have really high domain authority. And so thus, if they put out really good SEO optimized articles on Google, they can rank really well. But for a lot of smaller companies, even startups that have some level of traction, if your domain authority is, I would say, below a 40, you're probably not going to rank well on Google. And if you just go do a quick Google search and search SEMrush, Domain Authority Checker, or Ahrefs, let's do SEMrush is probably easier to spell than Ahrefs. If you go look up SEMrush Domain Authority Checker, it's going to tell you your domain authority score. And I would say, again, if you're below a 40 on there, you're a new company, you don't have a ton of backlinks, you haven't invested into SEO, the standalone site is probably going to be the move for you because that trade publication is going to let you really kind of have that networking-based approach. But if your domain authority is above a 40, I would say you're in an area where you could look at starting to do some additional SEO plays. And we're going to dive into that here in the second angle when we start talking about publishing on your company's website. All right, so let's talk about option 2 here, publishing your podcast on your company website. So again, I would say if you have a domain authority that is greater than 40, you should probably publish on your website because there's a pretty good chance that some of this content will rank well on Google, especially if you put intention and you create SEO articles behind these episodes. So a domain authority of 40 plus, that means your website is credible. It's been around for a while. You've likely either invested some level into SEO, or you've just been around the industry enough to where you've gotten enough links, enough people are talking about your company online that you have a decent domain authority. And so when you do this, when you have that domain authority, you can publish this on your website. Typically, that will go under a resources and insights section. Wherever you organize your blog, your webinars, your videos on your site, you typically will just want a tab for podcasts. So that's what you want to kind of create on your website and where you want to put this. Now, in terms of what you actually want on that page, we'll link to some examples of great podcast websites on here, but it tends to be pretty simple. If you think about kind of what a blog page looks like, that's really what you're creating here. So a lot of people struggle when they think about podcast websites and they're like, oh, this sounds complicated. I have to get a podcast on my site. But here's the thing to understand about getting a podcast on your website. You're really just putting up a blog post and a YouTube video. That's basically what you're doing. And I say a YouTube video just to make it simple so people can understand. But what I mean is your podcast audio just has an embed code. So it's just a piece of code that you put on your website, and then your podcast will show up on your site. And just the way that you would embed a video on your website, you would just put the embed code that you would get from YouTube, put that on your website with all the written content, and you have a video on your site. So getting a podcast on your website is really simple. It's literally just blog posts with embed codes. And that's all it is. And so I think a lot of people get scared or they think it's going to be overly complicated, but most often this can exist as just a category on your website that you can kind of filter. And a lot of times people will create standalone pages for their podcast. So again, we'll link to some examples here. Check out the show notes. Check out the article at contentallies.com about this episode, and you're going to see a whole list of some phenomenal podcast website examples. But the big things you might want to consider on the landing page for the podcast is just a quick description of the show. If you have a trailer for your show, it's a great place to put that as well. And then typically just maybe a bio about your hosts. That, and then basically just have your blog feed of all of your episodes. And that's really all it really takes to kind of get this podcast up on your website. So you don't need to overcomplicate it. You don't need to make it something crazy and elaborate. Most of the time when we're working with people, they just say, hey, we're going to, duplicate our blog page and then filter this content to just podcasts instead of blog posts. Or we're going to duplicate our webinars page or duplicate our videos page. And that tends to be how most people go about approaching getting a podcast on their website. You don't need to build something totally from scratch. Just keep it simple, keep it really rudimentary, and you can build from there. Now, the benefits of putting your podcast on your website, if you have a high domain authority, there's a lot of benefits to it. First of all, you're going to get all of the traffic from people that are coming to your site. So if you're a large enterprise with a good amount of traffic on your site, you're going to get a lot of hits on this. We've seen companies just get thousands of hits just purely because they have a highly trafficked website already. So again, just having it on your website, there is a lot of benefits of just having that as a resource there. The other thing is, again, the Google benefits. So if you repurpose each one of these episodes into an SEO article, you've got a great chance of getting a ton of SEO traffic from this as well. So beyond just distributing this through Apple and Spotify, you now could have this podcast showing up as a Google result for specific niche keywords within your industry. So again, there's a really great benefit around SEO, which is probably the biggest reason we see people shift their podcasts from external sites to their website. And so I would say most large enterprises, I would say 90% of the time, we are publishing this on their website. The one exception I will say is when it's just not realistic for the web team to get this on their website anytime soon. Unfortunately, that's the cases for many larger enterprise, large B2B companies. We say, hey, we need a new tab on the website, and they say, hey, that's great, but the web team's backlogged for 5 months. So what we often end up doing is just launching a standalone website and eventually killing that 5-6 months down the line once we're able to actually get that onto their core website. So you can kind of have a hybrid where you start external and then bring it onto the website as well. Some of the other things that come up with enterprise websites that we often see to consider is, are you allowed to do embed codes on your website? So believe it or not, we run into this quite often where there is strict policies at companies to not allow any embed codes. What I would say if they're like, oh, am I allowed to do that? If you're allowed to embed a YouTube video on your website, you're probably going to be allowed to embed these podcast episodes on your website. It's a very, very similar thing. But we have run into a handful of companies due to compliance issues, they do not allow any third-party tools embedded on their website. And thus, in those cases, what we'll typically do is have the podcast article on the site and then some links that say listen on Apple, listen on Spotify, watch it on YouTube. And you simply link off to where people can absorb the content in another medium. Not ideal, but that is kind of the case you can do what you would do if you ever have a situation where you just have issues and you're not allowed to use embed codes on your website. All right, now that we've hit option 1 of creating your own standalone podcast website, we hit option 2 of putting it onto your company website. Let's talk about the secret option number 3, the best of both worlds. So secret option number 3 is to put the podcast on your website for all of those wonderful SEO benefits that we just described, but then create a standalone website and de-index that standalone website from Google. Now, let me explain why this is a powerful strategy here. So what that does is that gives you all of this perception of a trade publication, of a media publication out there in the industry. And so it looks really nice. Whenever you're inviting guests on, you can create this entire wonderful, elaborate page that looks and designed beautiful. Our team does an amazing job of basically creating these and creating this perception. But then you also have all those SEO benefits of having it on your site. And so when I say I de-index the external site from Google, what that means is that Google will not include that into the search results, and thus you will not get pinged for having duplicate content. If you don't know anything about SEO, if you have duplicate content, you have the same content in 2 places on the internet, Google looks at that as a negative thing because it doesn't know what is the primary source. And so when you de-index it, you don't have to worry about having duplicate content there, and you can just route all of that SEO juice to your core website. So we've done this a lot where people wanted that perception of that trade industry publication, but they also wanted the SEO benefits on their own site. We've also done this in situations where we could not get it onto their website, so we just created that standalone site. And then we ultimately just kept it live, but we just de-indexed it as soon as we were able to get it onto the enterprise website. So again, all of those are great approaches there. It's different scenarios, but what I say is if you've got a big company, you've got a high domain authority, you can just do a quick domain authority checker, run that on Ahrefs or Google. If you're above a 40, would recommend putting this on your website for the SEO benefits. If you're below a 40, could definitely go either way, but you'll probably benefit from having that perception of a separate trade publication. So hopefully this was useful in helping you understand the strategy of the website. Definitely a lot more details. We consult all of our clients on figuring out the best way to get podcasts onto their website. We work with their web teams, support them, help them with the design, the implementation, all of those things. And so we're happy to support there. Also, if you check out the article on this site, if you go to contentallies.com and you head over to our resources section and you find this particular article about podcast websites, we are going to link to a ton of amazing examples to websites there. You'll see a bunch that we built. You're going to see a bunch of other ones out there that I think are just phenomenal ones in the industry. You're going to see examples of companies like Meta, AWS, Azure, Siemens Energy, Shell, Grin, how they're doing podcasts on their website. And so that you'll have a swipe file that you can just give to your web team and say, hey web team, here's 6 companies that did a great job of incorporating the podcast into their website. Can you model after these? And that's typically the best thing you can give a web company or your web team as well. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Say hello at contentallies.com. We love this stuff. We are in it every day. And we look forward to supporting you and helping you grow your B2B podcast. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on A Guide to B2B Podcasting.